Alright, let's get back to the Princess Bride. When we last left off, the prince had tracked Wesley and Buttercup across the mountain path, down the ravine, and knows that they're heading toward the fire swamp. So let's take a minute, go back to the map, and just look this over as a little bit of a catch-up, because, a lot's happened here. And want to make sure you remember it all. So, we have what started with the climb from the ship up the Cliffs of Insanity there. There was a duel with the Man in Black and Inigo, with the Man in Black winning. And he rushed along the mountain path, ambushed by Fezzik here, which, again, the Man in Black was victorious. And then the picnic with Vicini, with the 2 wine goblets, both poisoned, and Vicini ending up dead. And then Wesley and Buttercup running along the mountain's edge, and Buttercup shoving the Man in Black, also known as Wesley, down into the ravine. And now, because you can see the ravine, there's no way out for them to go. The sides are too steep. They can only continue running along the bottom of the ravine into the fire swamp. And see how the fire swamp comes out here into this bay right here. So that's important for you guys to be able to visualize what's happening and where they all are. And the prince has followed this same path all the way up to the ravine. He did not go down into the ravine, though, because he knows that Wesley and Buttercup will be trapped in that fire swamp. So let's get back to the story. Wesley, indeed, had not the least idea that he was racing dead into the fire swamp. He knew only, once Buttercup was down at the ravine bottom beside him, that to climb out would take, as Prince Humperdinck had assumed, too much time. Wesley noted only that the ravine bottom was flat rock and heading in the general direction he wanted to follow. So he and Buttercup fled along, both of them very much aware that gigantic forces were following them, and undoubtedly cutting into their lead. The ravine grew increasingly sheer as they went along, and Wesley soon realized that whereas once he probably could have helped her through the climb, now there was simply no way of doing so. He had made his choice, and there was no changing possible. Wherever the ravine led was their destination, and that, quite simply, was that. At this point in the story, my wife wants it known that she feels violently cheated, not being allowed the scene of reconciliation on the ravine floor between the lovers. My reply to her, and here's the break by the author coming in again. This is me, and I'm not trying to be confusing, but the above paragraph that I'm cutting into now is verbatim Morgenstern. He was continually referring to his wife in the unabridged book, saying that she loved the next section, or she thought that, all in all, the book was extraordinarily brilliant. Mrs. Morgenstern was rarely anything but supportive to her husband, unlike some wives I could mention. Sorry about that, Helen. But here's the thing. I got rid of almost all the intrusions when he told us what she thought. I didn't think the device added a whole lot, and besides, he was always complimenting himself through her, and today we know that hyping something too much does more harm than good, as any defeated political candidate will tell you when he pays his television bills. The thing of it is, I left this particular reference in because, for once, I totally happen to agree with Mrs. Morgenstern. I think it was unfair not to show the reunion, so I wrote one of my own. What I felt Buttercup and Wesley might have said, but Hiram, my editor, felt that made me just as unfair as Morgenstern here. If you're going to abridge a book in the author's own words, you can't go around sticking your own in. That was Hiram's point, and we really went round and round arguing over, I guess, a period of a month, in person, through letters, on the phone. Finally, we compromised to this extent. This, what you're reading in the regular type, is strict Morgenstern, verbatim. Cut, yes. Changed, no. But I got Hiram to agree that Harcourt would at least print up my scene. Ballantine had agreed to do the same, and now that this is back with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, they're taking it up again too. It's all of 3 pages, big deal. And if any of you want to see what it came out like, drop a note or postcard to Jelenka Harvey at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, 3 Park Avenue, New York City, and just mention you'd like the reunion scene. Don't forget to include your return address. You'd be stunned at how many people send in for things and don't put their return address down. The publishers agreed to spring for the postage cost, so your total expense is the note or card or whatever. It would really upset me if I turned out to be the only modern American writer who gave the impression that he was with a generous publishing house. They all stink. Sorry about that, Mr. Jovanich. So let me just add here that the reason they are so generous in paying this giant postage bill is because they fully expect nobody to write in. So please, if you have at least interest at all, or even if you don't, write in for my reunion scene. You don't have to read it, I'm not asking that, but I would love to cost those publishing geniuses a few dollars because, let's face it, they're not spending much on advertising my books. Let me just repeat the address for you, zip code and all. Jelenka Harvey, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, 3 Park Avenue, 19th floor, New York, 10016. And just ask for your copy of the reunion scene. This has gone longer than I planned, so I'm going to repeat that Morgenstern paragraph I interrupted. It'll read better. Over and out. At this point in the story, my wife wants it known that she feels violently cheated, not being allowed the scene of reconciliation on the ravine floor between the lovers. My reply to her is simply this. A. Each of God's beings, from the lowliest on up, is entitled to at least a few moments of genuine privacy. B. What actually was spoken, while moving enough to those involved at the actual time, flattens like toothpaste when transferred to paper for later reading. My dove, my only, bliss, etc. Nothing of importance in an expository way was related, because every time Buttercup began, "Tell me about yourself," Wesley quickly cut her off with, "Later, beloved, now is not the time." However, it should be noted, in fairness to all, that 1. He did weep. 2. Her eyes did not remain precisely dry. 3. There was more than one embrace. And 4. Both parties admitted that, without any qualifications whatsoever, they were more than a little glad to see each other. Besides, 5. Within a quarter of an hour, they were arguing. It began quite innocently, and the two of them kneeling, facing each other, Wesley holding her perfect face in his quick hands. "When I left you," he whispered, "you are already more beautiful than anything I dared to dream. In our years apart, my imaginings did their best to improve on your perfection. That night your face was forever behind my eyes, and now I see that vision who kept me company in my loneliness was a hag compared to the beauty now before me." "Enough about my beauty," Buttercup said. "Everybody always talks about how beautiful I am. I've got a mind, Wesley. Talk about that." "Throughout eternity I shall do that very thing," he told her. "But now we haven't time." He made it to his feet. The ravine fall had shaken and battered him, but all his bones survived the trip, uncracked. He helped her to her feet. "Wesley," Buttercup said then, "just before I started down after you, while I was still up there, I could hear you saying something, but the words were indistinct." "I've forgotten whatever it was." "Terrible liar." He smiled at her and kissed her cheek. "It's not important, believe me. The past has a way of being past." "We must not begin with secrets from each other." She meant it. He could tell that. "Trust me," he tried. "I do, so tell me your words or I shall be given reason not to." Wesley sighed. "What I was trying to get through to you, beloved sweet, what I was, as a matter of accurate fact, shouting with everything I have left was, 'Whatever you do, stay up there. Don't come down here, please.'" "You didn't want to see me." "Of course I wanted to see you. I just didn't want to see you down here." "Why ever not?" "Because now, my precious, we're more or less kind of trapped. I can't climb out of here and bring you with me without it taking all day. I can get out myself, most likely, without it taking all day, but with the addition of your lovely bulk, that's not about to happen." "Nonsense. You climb the cliffs of insanity, and this isn't nearly that steep." "And it took a little out of me, too, let me tell you. And after that little effort, I tangled with a fellow who knew a little something about fencing. And after that, I spent a few happy moments grappling with a giant. And after that, I had to outfake a Sicilian to death when any mistake meant it was a knife in the throat for you. And after that, I've run my lungs out a couple of hours. And after that, I was pushed 200 feet down a rock ravine. I'm tired, Buttercup. Don't you understand? Tired? I put in a night, is what I'm trying to get through to you. I'm not stupid, you know." "Quit bragging." "Stop being rude. When was the last time you read a book? The truth now, and picture books don't count. I mean something with print in it. Buttercup walked away from him. There are other things to read than print, she said. And the Princess of Hammersmith is displeased with you and thinking seriously of going home. With no more words, she whirled into his arms then, saying, Oh, Wesley, I didn't mean that. I didn't. Not a single syllable of it. Now, Wesley knew that she meant to say not a single syllable of it, because a syllabub was something you ate, with cream and wine mixed in together to form the base. But he also knew an apology when he heard one. So he held her very close, and shut his loving eyes, and only whispered, I knew it was false, believe me. Every single syllabub. And that out of the way, they started running as fast as they could along the flat rock floor of the ravine. Wesley, naturally enough, was considerably ahead of Buttercup with the realization that they were heading into the fire swamp. Whether it was a touch of sulfur riding a breeze or a flick of yellow flame far ahead in the daylight, he could not say for sure. But once he realized what was about to happen, he began as casually as possible to find a way to avoid it. A quick glance up the sheer ravine sides ruled out any possibility of his getting Buttercup past the climb. He dropped to the ground, as he had been doing every few minutes, to test the speed of their trackers. Now he guessed them to be less than half an hour behind and gaining. He rose and ran with her, faster, neither of them spending breath in conversation. It was only a matter of time before she understood what they were about to be into, so he decided to beat back her panic in any possible way now. I think we can slow down a bit now, he told her, slowing down a bit. They're still well behind. Buttercup took a deep breath of relief. Wesley made a show of checking their surroundings. Then he gave her his best smile. With any luck, he said, we should soon be safely in the fire swamp. Buttercup heard his speech, of course, but she did not take it well. A few words now on two related subjects. 1, fire swamps in general, and 2, the Florin Gilder fire swamp in particular. 1. Fire swamps are, of course, entirely misnamed. As to why this has happened, no one knows, though probably the colorful quality of the two words together is enough. Simply, there are swamps which contain a large percentage of sulfur and other gas bubbles that burst continually into flame. They are covered with the lush giant trees that shadow the ground, making the flame burst seem particularly dramatic. Because they are dark, they are almost always quite moist, thereby attracting the standard insect and alligator community that prefers a moist climate. In other words, a fire swamp is just a swamp, period. The rest is embroidery. 2. The Florin Gilder fire swamp did and does have some particular odd characteristics. A, the existence of snow sand, and B, the presence of the ROUS, about which a bit more later. Snow sand is usually, again incorrectly, identified with lightning sand. Nothing could be less accurate. Lightning sand is moist and basically destroys by drowning. Snow sand is as powdery as anything short of talcum and destroys by suffocation. Most particularly, though, the Florin Gilder fire swamp was used to frighten children. There was not a child in either country that at one time or another was not, when misbehaving very badly, threatened with abandonment in the fire swamp. Do that one more time and you're going to the fire swamp is as common as clean your plate, people are starving in China. And so as children grew, so did the danger of the fire swamp in their enlarging imaginations. No one, of course, ever actually went into the fire swamp, although every year or so a diseased ROUS might wander out to die. And its discovery would only add to the myth and the horror. The largest known fire swamp is, of course, within a day's drive of Perth. It is impenetrable and over 25 miles square. The one between Florin and Gilder was barely a third that size. No one had been able to discover if it was impenetrable or not. Buttercup stared at the fire swamp. As a child, she had once spent an entire nightmared year convinced that she was going to die there. Now she could not move another step. The giant trees blackened the ground ahead of her. From every part came the sudden flames. You cannot ask it of me, she said. I must. I once dreamed I would die here. So did I. So did we all. Were you 8 that year? I was. 8, 6, I can't remember. Wesley took her hand. She could not move. Must we? Wesley nodded. Why? Now is not the time. He pulled her gently. She still could not move. Wesley took her in his arms. Child, sweet child, I have a knife. I have my sword. I did not come across the world to lose you now. Buttercup was searching somewhere for a sufficiency of courage. Evidently, she found it in his eyes. At any rate, hand in hand, they moved into the shadows of the fire swamp. Prince Humperdinck just stared. He sat astride a white, studying the footsteps down on the floor of the ravine. There was simply no other conclusion. The kidnapper had dragged his princess into it. Count Rugen sat alongside. "Did they actually go in?" The prince nodded. Praying the answer would be no, the count asked, "Do you think we should follow them?" The prince shook his head. "They'll either live or die in there. If they die, I have no wish to join them. If they live, I'll greet them on the other side." "It's too far around," the count said. "Not for my whites." "We'll follow as best we can," the count said. He stared again at the fire swamp. "He must be very desperate, or very frightened, or very stupid, or very brave." "Very all four, I should think," the prince replied. Wesley led the way. Buttercup stayed just behind, and they made, from the outset, very good time. The main thing she realized was to forget your childhood dreams, for the fire swamp was bad, but it wasn't that bad. The odor of the escaping gases, which at first seemed almost totally punishing, soon diminished through familiarity. The sudden bursts of flame were easily avoided because just before they struck there was a deep kind of popping sound clearly coming from the vicinity where the flames would then appear. Wesley carried his sword in his right hand, his long knife in his left, waiting for the first ROUS, but none appeared. He had cut a very long piece of strong vine and coiled it over one shoulder and was busy working on it as they moved. "What we'll do once I have got this properly done is," he told her, moving steadily on beneath the giant trees, "we'll attach ourselves to each other so that way, no matter what the darkness, we'll be close. Actually, I think that's more precaution than necessary because, to tell you the truth, I'm almost disappointed. This place is bad, all right, but it's not that bad. Don't you agree?" Buttercup wanted to, totally, and she would have too, only by then the snow sand had her. Wesley turned only in time to see her disappear. Buttercup had simply let her attention wander for a moment. The ground seemed solid enough, and she had no idea what snow sand looked like anyway. But once her front foot began to sink in, she could not pull back, and even before she could scream, she was gone. It was like falling through a cloud. The sand was the finest in the world, and there was no bulk to it whatsoever, and at first, no unpleasantness. She was just falling, gently, through this soft, powdery mass, falling farther and farther from anything resembling life. But she could not allow herself to panic. Wesley had instructed her on how to behave if this happened, and she followed his words now. She spread her arms and spread her fingers and forced herself into the position resembling that of a dead man's float in swimming. All this because Wesley had told her to, because the more she could spread herself, the slower she would sink, and the slower she sank, the quicker he could dive down after her and catch her. Buttercup's ears were now caked with snow sand all the way in, and her nose was filled with snow sand, both nostrils, and she knew if she opened her eyes, a million tiny, fine bits of snow sand would seep behind her eyelids, and now she was beginning to panic badly. How long had she been falling? Hours, it seemed, and she was having pain in holding her breath. "You must hold it till I find you," he had said. "You must go into a dead man's float, and you must close your eyes, and hold your breath, and I'll come get you, and we'll both have a wonderful story for our grandchildren." Buttercup continued to sink. The weight of the sand began to brutalize her shoulders. The small of her back began to ache. It was agony keeping her arms outstretched and her fingers spread when it was all so useless. The snow sand was heavier and heavier on her now, and she sank always down. And was it bottomless, as they thought, as when they were children? Did you just sink forever until the sand ate away at you, and then did your poor bones continue the trip forever down? No, surely there had to be somewhere a resting place. A resting place, Buttercup thought. What a wonderful thing. I'm so tired, and I want to rest. And, "Wesley, come save me," she screamed, or started to. Because in order to scream, you had to open your mouth, so all she really got out was the first sound of the first word. "What?" After that, the snow sand was down into her throat, and she was done. Wesley had made a terrific start. Before she had even entirely disappeared, he had dropped his sword and long knife and had gotten the vine coil from his shoulder. It took him next to no time to knot one end around a giant tree, and, holding tight to the free end, he simply dove headlong into the snow sand, kicking his feet as he sank for greater speed. There was no question in his mind of failure. He knew he would find her, and he knew she would be upset and hysterical and possibly even brain-tumbled, but alive. And that was, in the end, the only fact of lasting import. The snow sand had his ears and the nose blocked, and he hoped she had not panicked, and remembered to spread eagle her body so that he could catch her quickly with his headlong dive. If she remembered, it wouldn't be that hard. The same, really, as rescuing a drowning swimmer in murky water. They floated slowly down. You dove straight down. You kicked, you pulled with your free arm. You gained on them. You grabbed them. You brought them to the surface. And the only real problem then would be convincing your grandchildren that such a thing had actually happened and was not just another family fable. He was still concerning his mind with the infants yet unborn when something happened he had not counted on. The vine was not long enough. He hung suspended for a moment, holding to the end of it as it stretched straight up through the snow sand to the security of the giant tree. To release the vine was truly madness. There was no possibility of forcing your body all the way back up to the surface. A few feet of ascension was possible if you kicked wildly, but no more. So if he let go of the vine and did not find her within a finger snap, it was all up for both of them. Wesley let go of the vine without a qualm because he had come too far to fail now. Failure was not even a problem to be considered. Down he sank then, and within a finger snap he had his hand around her wrist. Wesley screamed then himself in horror and surprise, and the snow sand gouged at his throat, for what he had grabbed was a skeleton wrist, bone only, no flesh left at all. That happened in snow sand. Once the skeleton was picked clean, it would begin often to float like seaweed in a quiet tide, shifting this way and that, sometimes resurfacing, more often just journeying through the snow sand for eternity. Wesley threw the wrist away and reached out blindly with both hands now, scrabbling wildly to touch some part of her because failure was not a problem. Failure is not a problem, he told himself. It is not a problem to be considered. So forget failure, just keep busy and find her. And he found her. Her foot, more precisely, and pulled it to him, and then his arms was around her perfect waist, and he began to kick with any strength left, needing now to rise a few yards to the end of the vine. The idea that it might be difficult finding a single vine strand in a small sea of snow sand never bothered him. Failure was not a problem. He would simply have to kick, and when he had kicked hard enough, he would rise, and when he had risen enough, he would reach out for the vine, and when he reached out, it would be there. And when it was there, he would tie her to it, and with his last breath, he would pull them both up to life. Which is exactly what happened. She remained unconscious for a very long time. Wesley busied himself as best he could, cleansing the snow sand from ears and nose and mouth, and, most delicate of all, from beneath the lids of her eyes. The length of her quietness disturbed him vaguely. It was almost as if she knew she had died and was afraid to find out for a fact that it was true. He held her in his arms, rocked her slowly. Eventually she was blinking. For a time she looked around and around. "We live then," she managed finally. "We're a hardy breed." "What a wonderful surprise." No need, he was going to say, no need to worry, but her panic struck too quickly. It was a normal enough reaction, and he did not try to block it, but rather held her firmly and let the hysteria run its course. She shuddered for a time as if she fully intended to fly apart, but that was the worst. From there, it was but a few minutes to quiet sobbing. Then she was Buttercup again. Wesley stood, buckled on his sword, replaced his long knife. "Come," he said. "We have far to go." "Not until you tell me," she replied. "Why must we endure this?" "Now is not the time." Wesley held out his hand. "It is the time." She stayed where she was, on the ground. Wesley sighed. She meant it. "All right," he said finally. "I'll explain. But we must keep moving." Buttercup waited. "We must get through the fire swamp," Wesley began, "for one good and simple reason." Once he had started talking, Buttercup stood, following close behind him, and as he went on, "I had always intended getting to the far side. I had not, I must admit, expected to go through. Around was my intention, but the ravine forced me to change." "The good and simple reason," Buttercup prompted. "On the far end of the fire swamp is the mouth of Giant Eel Bay, and anchored far out in the deepest waters of that bay is a great ship, Revenge. The Revenge is the sole property of the dread pirate Roberts." "The man you killed? The man who killed you," Buttercup said. "That man, the one who broke my heart. The dread pirate Roberts took your life. That was the story I was told." "Quite correct," Wesley said. "And that ship is our destination." "You know the dread pirate Roberts? You are friendly with such a man?" "It's a little more than that," Wesley said. "I don't expect you to quite grasp this all at once. Just believe it's true. You see, I am the dread pirate Roberts." I fail to see how that is possible, since he has been marauding for 20 years, and you only left me 3 years ago. I am myself often surprised at life's little quirks. Did he in fact capture you when you were sailing for the Carolinas? He did. His ship Revenge captured the ship I was on, the Queen's Pride, and we were all to be put to death. But Roberts did not kill you. Clearly. Why? I cannot say for sure, but I think it is because I asked him please not to. The please, I suspect, aroused his interest. I didn't beg or offer bribery, as the others were doing. At any rate, he held off with his sword long enough to ask, "Why should I make an exception of you?" And I explained my mission, how I had to get to America to get money to reunite me with the most beautiful woman ever reared by man, namely you. "I doubt that she is as beautiful as you imagine," he said, and he raised his sword again. "Hair the color of autumn," I said, "and skin like wintry cream." "Wintry cream, eh?" he said. He was interested now, at least a bit, so I went on describing the rest of you, and at the end, I knew I had him convinced of the truth of my affection for you. "I'll tell you, Wesley," he said then, "I feel genuinely sorry about this, but if I make an exception in your case, news will get out to the dread pirate Roberts has gone soft, and that will mark the beginning of my downfall. For once they stop fearing you, piracy becomes nothing but work, work, work all the time, and I'm far too old for such a life." "I swear I will never tell, not even my beloved," I said. "And if you will let me live, I will be your personal valet and slave for 5 full years. And if I ever once complain or cause you anger, you may chop my head off then and there, and I will die with praise for your fairness on my lips." I knew I had him thinking. "Go below," he said. "I'll most likely kill you tomorrow." Wesley stopped talking for a moment and pretended to clear his throat because he had spotted the first ROUS following behind them. There seemed no need yet to alert her, so he just continued to clear his throat and hurry along between the flame bursts. "What happened tomorrow?" Buttercup urged. "Go on." "Well, you know what industrious fellow I am. You remember how I like to learn and how I'd already trained myself to work 20 hours a day. I decided to learn what I could about piracy in the time left allotted to me, since it would at least keep my mind off my coming slaughter. So I helped the cook and I cleaned the hold and, in general, did whatever was asked of me, hoping that my energies might be favorably noted by the dread pirate Roberts himself. "Well, I've come to kill you," he said the next morning, and I said, "Thank you for the extra time. It's been most fascinating. I've learned such a great deal." And he said, "Overnight? What could you learn in that time?" And I said that no one had ever explained to your cook the difference between table salt and cayenne pepper. "Things have been a bit fiery this trip," he admitted. "Go on, what else?" And I explained that there would have been more room in the hold if the boxes had been stacked differently, and then he noticed that I had completely reorganized things down there, and, fortunately for me, there was more room. And finally he said, "Very well, you may be my valet for a day. I've never had a valet before. Probably I won't like it, so I'll kill you in the morning." Every night for the next year he always said something like that to me. "Thank you for everything, Wesley. Good night now. I'll probably kill you in the morning." By the end of that year, of course, we were more than valet and master. He was a pudgy little man, not at all fierce as you would expect the dread pirate Roberts to be, and I like to think he was as fond of me as I of him. By then I had learned really quite a great deal about sailing and hand-fighting and fencing and throwing the long knife, and had never been in as excellent physical condition. At the end of one year, my captain said to me, "Enough of this valet business, Wesley. From now on, you are my second in command." And I said, "Thank you, sir, but I could never be a pirate." And he said, "You want to get back to that autumn-haired creature of yours, don't you?" And I didn't even have to bother answering that. "A good year or two of piracy, and you'll be rich, and back you go." And I said, "Your men have been with you for years, and they aren't rich." And he said, "That's because they are not the captain. I'm going to retire soon, Wesley, and the revenge will be yours." I must admit, beloved, I weakened a bit there, but we reached no final decision. Instead, he agreed to let me assist him in the next few captures and see how I liked it, which I did. There was now another ROUS following them, flanking them as they moved. Buttercup saw them now. "Wesley! Shh, it's all right. I'm watching them. Shall I finish? Will it take your mind off them?" You helped him with the next few captures," Buttercup said, "to see if you liked it." Wesley dodged a sudden burst of flame, shielded Buttercup from the heat. Not only did I like it, but it turned out I was talented as well. So talented that Robert said to me one April morning, "Wesley, the next ship is yours. Let's see how you do." That afternoon we spotted a fat Spanish beauty loaded for Madrid. I sailed up close. They were in a panic. "Who is it?" their captain cried. "Wesley," I told them. "Never heard of you," he answered, and with that they opened fire. Disaster. They had no fear of me at all. I was so flustered I did everything wrong, and soon they got away. I was, do I have to add, disheartened. Roberts called me to his cabin. I slunk in like a whipped boy. "Buck up," he told me, and then he closed the door and we were quite alone. "What I'm about to tell you I've never said before, and you must guard it closely." I of course said I would. "I am not the dread pirate Roberts," he said. "My name is Ryan. I inherited this ship from the previous dread pirate Roberts, just as you will inherit it from me. The man I inherited it from was not the real dread pirate Roberts either. His name was Cumberbund. The real original dread pirate Roberts has been retired 15 years and has been living like a king in Patagonia." I confessed my confusion. "It's really very simple," Ryan explained. "After several years, the original Roberts was so rich, he wanted to retire. Clooney was his friend and first mate, so he gave the ship to Clooney, who had an identical experience to yours. The first ship he attempted to board nearly blew him out of the water, so Roberts, realizing the name was the thing that inspired the necessary fear, sailed the Revenge to port, changed crews entirely, and Clooney told everyone he was the dread pirate Roberts, and who was to know he was not? When Clooney retired rich, he passed the name to Cumberbund to me, and I, Felix Raymond Ryan of Boodle, outside Liverpool, now dub thee, Wesley, the dread pirate Roberts. All we need to do is to land, take on some new young pirates. I will sail alone for a few days as Ryan, your first mate, and will tell everyone about my years with you, the dread pirate Roberts. Then you will let me off when they are all believers, and the waters of the world are yours." Wesley smiled at Buttercup. "So now you know, and you should also realize why it is foolish to be afraid." "But I am afraid." "It will all be happy at the end. Consider, a little over 3 years ago you were a milkmaid and I was a farm boy. Now you are almost a queen, and I rule uncontested on the water. Surely such individuals were never intended to die in a fire swamp." "How can you be so sure?" "Well, because we're together, hand in hand, in love." "Oh yes," Buttercup said. "I keep forgetting that." Both her words and her tone were a trifle standoffish, something Wesley surely would have noticed had not an ROUS attacked him from the tree branch, sinking its giant teeth into his unprotected shoulder, forcing him to earth in a very unexpected spurt of blood. The other two that had been following launched their attack too, ignoring Buttercup, driving forward with all their hungry strength to Wesley's bleeding shoulder. Any discussion of the ROUS, Rodents of Unusual Size, must begin with the South American capybara, which has been known to reach a weight of 150 pounds. They are nothing but water hogs, however, and present very little danger. The largest pure rat is probably the Tasmanian, which has actually been weighed at 100 pounds. But they have little agility, tending to sloth when they reach full growth, and most Tasmanian herdsmen have learned with ease to avoid them. The fire swamp ROUS were a pure rat strain, weighed usually 80 pounds, and had the speed of wolfhounds. They were also carnivorous and capable of frenzy. The rats struggled with each other to reach Wesley's wound. Their enormous front teeth tore at the unprotected flesh of his left shoulder, and he had no idea if Buttercup was already half devoured. He only knew that if he didn't do something desperate right then and there, she would be. So he intentionally rolled his body into a spurt of flame. His clothes began to burn. That he expected. But more important, the rats shied away from the heat and the flames for just an instant, but that was enough for him to reach and throw his long knife into the heart of the nearest beast. The other two turned instantly on their own kind and began eating it while it was still screaming. Wesley had his sword by then, and with 2 quick thrusts, the trio of rats was disposed of. "Hurry!" he shouted to Buttercup, who stood frozen where she had been when the first rat landed. "Bandages! Bandages!" Wesley cried. "Make me some bandages or we die!" And with that, he He rolled onto the ground, tore off his burning clothes, and set to work kicking mud into the deep wound in his shoulder. "They're like sharks, blood creatures. It's blood they thrive on." He smeared more and more mud into his wound. "We must stop my bleeding, and we must cover the wound so they do not smell it. If they don't smell the blood, we'll survive. If they do, we're for it. So help me, please." Buttercup ripped her clothes into patches and ties, and they worked at the wound, caking the blood with mud from the floor of the fire swamp, then bandaging and rebandaging over it. "We'll know soon enough," Wesley said, because 2 more rats were watching them. Wesley stood, sword in hand. "If they charge, they smell it," he whispered. The giant rats stood watching. "Come," Wesley whispered. 2 more giant rats joined the first pair. Without warning, Wesley's sword flashed, and the nearest rat was bleeding. The other 3 contented themselves with that for a while. Wesley took Buttercup's hand, and again they started to move. "How bad are you?" she said. "I'm in something close to agony, but we can talk about that later. Hurry now!" They hurried. They had been in the fire swamp for 1 hour, and it turned out to be the easiest one they had of the 6 it took to cross it. But they crossed it, alive and together, hand very much in hand. It was nearly dusk when they at last saw the great ship Revenge far out in the deepest part of the bay. Wesley, still within the confines of the fire swamp, sank, beaten, to his knees. For between him and his ship were more than a few inconveniences. From the north sailed in half the great armada. From the south now the other half. 100 mounted horsemen armored and armed. In front of them the Count. And out alone, in front of all, the 4 whites, with the prince astride the leader. Wesley stood. "We took too long in crossing. The fault is mine." "I accept your surrender," the prince said. Wesley held Buttercup's hand. "No one is surrendering," he said. "You're acting silly now," the prince replied. "I credit you with bravery. Don't make yourself a fool." "What is so foolish about winning?" Wesley wanted to know. "It's my opinion that in order to capture us, you will have to come into the fire swamp. We have spent many hours here now. We know where the snow sand waits. I doubt that you or your men will be any too anxious to follow us in here, and by morning we will have slipped away." "I doubt that somehow," said the prince, and he gestured out to sea. Half the armada had begun to give chase to the great ship Revenge, and the Revenge alone was sailing, as it had to do, away. "Surrender," the prince said. "It will not happen!" "Surrender!" the prince shouted. "Death first!" Wesley roared. "Will you promise not to hurt him?" Buttercup whispered. "What was that?" the prince said. "What was that?" Wesley said. Buttercup took a step forward and said, "If we surrender, freely and without struggle, if life returns to what it was 1 dusk ago, will you swear not to hurt this man?" Prince Humperdinck raised his right hand. "I swear on the grave of my soon-to-be dead father and the soul of my already dead mother that I shall not hurt this man, and if I do, may I never hunt again though I live 1,000 years." Buttercup turned to Wesley. "There," she said. "You can't ask for more than that, and that is the truth." "The truth," said Wesley, "is that you would rather live with your prince than die with your love." "I'd rather live than die, I admit it." "We're talking of love, madam." There was a long pause. Then Buttercup said it. "I can live without love." And with that, she left Wesley alone. Prince Humperdinck watched her as she began the long cross to him. "When we are out of sight," he said to the Count Rugen, "take that man in black and put him in the 5th level of the Zoo of Death." The Count nodded. "For a moment I believed you when you swore." "I spoke truth. I never lie," the prince replied. "I said I would not hurt him, but I never for a moment said he would not suffer pain. You will do the actual tormenting. I will only spectate." He opened his arms then for his princess. "He belongs to the ship Revenge," Buttercup said. "He is—" she began, about to tell Wesley's story, but that was not for her to repeat. "A simple sailor, and I have known him since I was a child. Will you arrange that?" "Must I swear again?" "No need," Buttercup said, because she knew, as did everyone, that the prince was more forthright than any Florinese. Come along, my princess. He took her hand. Buttercup went away with him. Wesley watched it all. He stood silently at the edge of the fire swamp. It was darker now, but the flame spurts behind him outlined his face. He was glazed with fatigue. He had been bitten, cut, gone without rest, had assaulted the cliffs of insanity, had saved and taken lives. He had risked his world, and now it was walking away from him, hand in hand with a ruffian prince. Then Buttercup was gone, out of sight. Wesley took a breath. He was aware of the score of soldiers starting to surround him, and probably he could have made a few of them perspire for their victory. But for what point? Wesley sagged. Come, sir, Count Rugen approached. We must get you safely to your ship. We are both men of action, Wesley replied. Lies do not become us. Well spoken, said the Count, and with one sudden swing he clubbed Wesley into insensitivity. Wesley fell like a beaten stone, his last conscious thought being of the Count's right hand. It was six-fingered, and Wesley could never quite remember having encountered that deformity before. All right, finally made it through Chapter 5, one of the longest chapters here. But one of the most important for all the backstory and knowing all these characters who are now involved. So, next time, into Chapter 6 with the festivities, but I have a feeling that might be a little short. All right, see you next time.